Hi there, everyone. I'm Ken Cook, and you've joined me on another one of my episodes. Today's topic, pesticides, gives me episodes all the time. Between what the science tells us and what the chemical companies and politicians have to say, it's easy to get confused over what's safe and what's not. Luckily, I have two outstanding guests to help guide us through this chemical quagmire. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Alexis Temkin. Dr. Temkin is a senior toxicologist at EWG who does outstanding work on policy and research in areas of personal care, cleaning products, pesticides, and tap water. Dr. Temkin, or Lexi, is not only a brilliant scientist, she's also a great translator of complicated science into language that all of us can understand, and we're lucky to have her at EWG. I'm also joined by a personal hero of mine, Dr. Phil Landrigan. Phil Landrigan is a pediatrician, public health physician, and epidemiologist who specializes in the harm chemical exposures can cause to the health of infants and children. His work has been the basis of federal policy for decades. His early contributions to the understanding of lead exposure in children contributed to the U.S. government's decision to remove lead from paint and gasoline. Those actions dramatically reduced lead levels in children's blood. His work in the 1990s on pesticide exposure catalyzed a fundamental revamping of U.S. pesticide policy. Let's just say we've got the best of the best today on these topics, folks, so let's jump in. EWG has long worked on pesticides. Back then, pesticide work was kind of stuck. There was a controversy over ALAR in the late 1980s. People were scared because EPA was stuck. They knew ALAR was dangerous, carcinogenic, but they couldn't take it off the market because it was already on the market. And there was a 60 Minutes episode where the acting administrator of EPA actually said into the camera on 60 Minutes,
"There's no question if it was a new chemical, not yet on the market, and it was brought to the agency to be evaluated, that it would not get on the market based on the data that was available."
Well, Dr. Moore, I don't understand that.
And of course, parents went crazy. Why are we allowing this kind of thing to happen? So from the very beginning, EWG was in the right in the very center of pesticide policymaking. The White House announced their support for our report and for the National Academy report, and it eventually shaped pesticide law in 1996. That's a little bit of the ancient history at EWG, going back to our founding 31 or so years ago. Today, we continue to do that work on pesticides. We've continued to stay up with the science, and I'm especially thrilled to have with me today my colleague, Dr. Alexis Temkin, or Lexi, as I know her,
Yep.
Who has been with us now for
6 or 7 years.
6 or 7 years. Yeah. We publish a report every year. We have for many years now, called The Shopper's Guide to Pesticides and Produce. It has two halves. One is the Dirty Dozen, fruits and vegetables that have the most pesticides in them. And the other is the Clean 15, fruits and vegetables that are grown conventionally with chemical agriculture, but because of the types of pesticides that are used and when they're applied, they don't show up in the fruit.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've noticed over the years, first of all, is that people generally don't want to eat pesticides if they can avoid it. They just, if you offer them an apple with pesticides and an apple with not, they'll say, I don't know. I think I'm not in the mood for the one with pesticides. I think I'll eat the one that's clean. But there's a huge debate over whether the residues left in the apples that have been grown conventionally are worth worrying about. And a lot of our work at EWG is looking at that question and basically asking, yes, we know it's legal to eat that apple, but based on all the science we know, is it safe? And when you think about the shopper's guide, when you think about everyone's day-to-day experience, you're the scientist who looks at all these studies. How do you explain to someone why they shouldn't just pay attention to the pesticide industry or some of the agricultural interests who say it's perfectly safe, it's been approved by the government, don't worry about it?
Well, so I think there's a few pieces here that maybe people don't fully understand in terms of how pesticides, are regulated and approved. And you just really touched on one, which is that these are companies that are manufacturing pesticides that come to the agency charged with regulating them, right? In this case, it's the Office of Pesticide Programs at EPA. And they say, hey, I want to register this. And here's the data. We generated this data. This is industry generated data to have EPA review and determine what might be a harmful effect, what might be the dose that doesn't cause that harmful effect. And then EPA goes on with their approval process from there. But, this is data that's really hasn't been peer reviewed, which, if you come through the academic scientific space, that is kind of that gold standard, that currency of how science is done. So I remember when I was in graduate school, when I sort of learned about this difference between sort of regulatory toxicology and the sort of academic toxicology that I was learning and being really, brought up in, they just didn't make sense to me in terms of the principles for how they were done.
How can you have two sciences?
Yeah, and they're very different.
Yeah.
So the industry-funded studies are usually based on these really high doses of exposure. There's sort of this conventional thought that only high doses are an issue. And so often they don't test this low dose range where that's actually where most of us are exposed. We fall into that lower dose range. And so there's very little data there. And these studies are designed to focus on the adults, not so much the children. So there are, developmental studies that need to be done, but not a lot of them aren't required. They're only kind of asked by the EPA after some other data might come up. And even then, it's pretty rare. So they're just shifted in this way that from academic toxicology, where you're always thinking about developmental exposures because kids are more sensitive. You're thinking about outcomes like reproductive function or neurotoxicity because, those are really sensitive. Those are sometimes just missed in these regulatory studies. So that's kind of the undertone for how pesticides get approved. And I think there's some really good examples to come back to this legal doesn't mean safe issue necessarily, where, I think to kind of put it like on a timeline, this regulatory agency EPA, right, is set with this task of saying, what is a safe exposure limit, right? And it's based off this industry data. And often over time, that safe level keeps going down, right? As we generate more data.
Yeah.
And it's not because this chemical like spontaneously became more toxic, right? It's been the same thing from the beginning. Yeah. It's just that we have more data. We have a greater understanding of its harmful effects. But those harmful effects were still there at those exposure limits that were happening at the beginning, right?
They were never safe.
They were never
just
necessarily
legal.
safe.
And the consumers remember that the government has said this pesticide is safe right up until the minute they ban it. And then it's not safe. And they've made some agreement with industry to phase it out. I think of the example of chlorpyrifos. I think it came on the market. It was approved in 1968, I think. So it stayed on the market. And every time there was a challenge, every time there was a question raised, maybe an academic study coming out and raising questions about something, EPA would pretty much say it's safe, and the pesticide industry would say, we told you so, and farmers would say it's a valuable tool, we can't do without it. But consumers remember. And so now as it's played out, it's gone back and forth. Chlorpyrifos is a perfect example of a regulatory tennis match, right? It's legal.
Yeah.
It's not legal.
Yeah. I mean,
it's an insecticide, we should say.
It is an insecticide. It's called an organophosphate. And this is a class of chemicals that's really been known now to be extremely toxic to the developing brain. And chlorpyrifos was really the poster child of understanding that toxicity. And that was because there were studies that were being done in the Central Valley in California looking at agricultural communities. So these are people who are living near pesticide applications, in many cases working with actually applying pesticides or coming in contact with fruits and vegetables that have been sprayed. And these epidemiological data, so studies on real human people and real world experiences with pesticides, was really showing harmful effects of chlorpyrifos on brain development in children. So you were seeing lower IQ levels, really cognitive and behavioral functions. During EPA's risk assessment, there was actually during 2016, the EPA finally said, you know what, we're going to use this epidemiological data. We're going to use the peer-reviewed data from real people exposed to this. And when they set that safe limit using those data, the dose was 650 times lower than what the previous risk assessment had shown. And actually, unfortunately, the current risk assessment that EPA is using. To your point, it went back and forth with different administrations because unfortunately, some of that gets politicized in terms of there might be really good science going on at the agency, scientists doing really good work, but it's top-down sort of communication that then changes the outcome of an assessment. And unfortunately, that leads to relaxing public health protections in some cases.
So at the end of the Obama administration, just to kind of bring everybody along, based on this new review, they proposed a ban for chlorpyrifos. Trump came in. There was all kinds of shenanigans that raised questions about influence peddling by lobbyists from the pesticide company, contributions to Trump's inauguration event and things like that. And suddenly the decision flipped and it was legal again, rescinded the Obama regulation. Fast forward to the Biden administration, they go back and say, no, that ban should have been upheld. It should have stayed in place. We should be out of the chlorpyrifos business for fruits and vegetables and other crops. Then that was challenged last year in court, and they remanded the decision back to the lower court. And meanwhile, they reinstated the use of chlorpyrifos.
And unfortunately, because they changed, again, the basis for their risk assessment and are allowing those safer levels, there's actually now, 11 uses of chlorpyrifos on food that are going to be continued to be allowed. But if they had really stuck with that 2016 assessment that really was based on the better data, the more sensitive endpoint, protecting children's health, there was no way the math was going to work, right? Yeah. The dose was too low. It didn't matter how you used it. It wasn't going to be safe. And so that's sort of problems that we see come up with a few different types of pesticides. And it doesn't mean that's the case for every single one.
Right.
But there are so many pesticides out there, right? There's 400 to 500 active registered ingredients. If you just look at food, there's 250 pesticides found in fruits and vegetables. So there's a lot of uncertainty there.
Yeah. And I think we've concluded that the agency has not done its job. Yeah. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So you're talking about the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996. And one of the big things that was part of that law was this acknowledgement that children's health, was at risk from pesticide exposure. And that something needed to be done. Children's health needed to be explicitly considered and protected for in the law. So they have what's called this FQPA safety factor. And the idea was to add, an additional factor of 10 in terms of setting that safe dose to account for children's health and children's sensitivity. And what we've seen most of the time, that safety factor, that additional protection is getting waived, and not necessarily for good reasons. Yeah. You read some of these rationales and you're just, they're kind of mind-boggling. They'll say, we observed, adult neurotoxicity, but we didn't check for developmental neurotoxicity, but children's health is protected. So there's just kind of these statements that really don't make a lot of sense. And that's one of the bigger problems.
It's disturbing because when you have a public health breakthrough like that, a new way of thinking, and the agency just can't absorb it, why is that? And it's not really just the science. It's almost as if the agency is pre-programmed in a way to approved pesticides.
And then the other part of that law was actually asking EPA to finally study endocrine disruption in pesticide risk assessments. And that was 25-ish, more than 25 years ago. It's almost 30 years ago. And EPA actually just started releasing a plan, really, a strategy for how they were actually going to start looking at endocrine disruption, because there was this really acknowledgement that they haven't really done anything there for 30 years or so. And actually, one thing that I found super interesting when they started talking about that was that they said, okay, well, we're going to look at all the animal data that we have on pesticides already, because pesticides have to come with this industry data, and it's supposed to look at reproductive toxicity, and it's supposed to be really complete. And they actually said, well, for 406 pesticides, of those, only 20% actually have updated reproductive toxicity studies. Because one of the things with endocrine disruption is that we've learned is that exposure during early life can impact development of disease later in life, and then also impact the next generation. There's a paper that came out called The Key Characteristics of Endocrine Disruptors, and there's 10 different ways that these chemicals impact the body. They can change hormone levels. They can change the expression of those receptors. They can alter the DNA at how those receptors bind. So there's many different ways that chemicals can interact with the endocrine system that can have really adverse health effects.
You know, you don't go to the doctor and get diagnosed with endocrine disruption.
No.
You go to the doctor and you might have metabolic syndrome or something that's related to how your hormonal system's not working.
Mm-hmm.
But endocrine disruption itself is not considered a health endpoint that we would regulate to protect people like we would if it was cancer, cause cancer, or something that would interfere with neurological function like lead does or what have you.
There has been some progress there where actually the European Union has finally started classifying chemicals about whether or not they are endocrine disruptors based on some of those key impacts. So reproductive function, sexual development. Basically, can you show that the chemical is interacting with hormones that then causes some of those other effects? But it's kind of brand new in terms of actually seeing how that regulation is going to play out. It's something that I'm excited to watch and see how it happens.
The exposures are happening. These things that an academic study might show harm to the endocrine system and lead to an adverse health outcome. That same stuff could be in your fruits and vegetables and food. It could be sprayed in your home. It could be on your lawn. And that's why we tell people, if you can avoid the exposures, even though they're legal, you might want to do it. And then we add the extra wrinkle, which drives people crazy when we talk about it. And that's why we're talking about it. You should be driven a little crazy, which is that we're never exposed or rarely exposed to one chemical at a time.
Yeah.
You mentioned the hundreds of chemicals in the American diet introduced by just fruits and vegetables, right?
Yeah, just pesticides on fruits and
just
vegetables.
Pesticides on fruits and not industrial chemicals that might be in your carpet or in your shampoo or whatever, just fruits and vegetables and just pesticides. But we regulate these as if human beings are exposed to them one at a time, never in a mixture. And yet you could have multiple carcinogens, multiple endocrine disruptors.
Yeah, and you do.
And you do. And we've tested blood and found it in newborns, in fact, umbilical cord blood. Why aren't we being more protective about that? Why isn't that another sort of safety factor? You have 100 endocrine disrupting chemicals in you already.
Yeah.
You shouldn't allow the next one.
It's actually not necessarily that complicated. Some of it is, but for instance, for chemicals that act the same way. So let's take, for example, chemicals that bind the estrogen receptor. And this has been shown in animal studies. If you have 5 of them, they typically work in a dose that's additive. So you can kind of determine how the doses might compare to each other and what then a safe dose might become if you're exposed to a mixture of them. So when they were first studying this, it was called this idea of something from nothing. So the principle being that if you actually expose animals to a mixture of chemicals that on their own shouldn't have any effect, right? So if you just look at the estrogen receptor activation of this one chemical, it doesn't cause an effect at this dose. If you take all those chemicals at that nothing dose, which is what you could call it, you all of a sudden start to see estrogenic effects because they start interacting with one another. It's additive. In some cases, it's more than additive. It's synergistic. So you actually see a stronger effect.
1 + 1 is 3.
Yeah, exactly. And so I totally agree. I think this mixtures safety factor would be a great idea. There's something kind of proposed called mixtures attributable factor in the EU. It hasn't really gone through the regulatory process, but there are a lot of people thinking in that direction.
And you're one of them.
And yeah, I am one of them.
We're working on that here at EWG.
Over and over again, a lot of animal data has shown that that safe dose is no longer safe when you start to bring a mixture into the question. And, if you look for pesticides in air, there's never just one. If you look for them in food, there's never just one, right? And really the likelihood is much more that there's many more.
Yeah. And what we're concerned about as a public interest organization is you're really not being protected based on what we know from the independent science.
Yeah, there's data to support it from human studies. This is work out of Harvard University where they looked at consumption of high residue fruits and vegetables. So fruits and vegetables with a lot of pesticides and low residue fruits and vegetables with not a lot. That if you're consuming more of the high residue foods, that's linked to some adverse health effects like implications on fertility. It's also been associated with cancer risk, as well as actually reducing the protective effect for cardiovascular events that you get from fruits and vegetables, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around that one, but that's looking at mixtures in not necessarily measuring all of them, but thinking about them, how they might interact together. So
in the real world.
In the real world, exactly. And there's data, then you test this in animal studies and you see the same thing replicated. So it's robust science. It's not just a theory. There is a lot of evidence there.
We're not just scared. We're scared for good reason.
Yeah.
And worried for good reason. We always say at EWG that we're driven by facts, not emotion, but sometimes the facts really piss us off.
That is a good saying.
And is there anything about it?
Do I have to pick
one
just
thing?
one?
It's hard to pick one.
It's hard to pick one. No, I think if you were to walk past my office any day and I'm reading some EPA risk assessments, I'm probably screaming something
the
like
steam
this.
Is coming out of
like
your
it just
ears.
doesn't make sense. It's terrible. So I think there's this one case that we really haven't talked about yet, and this is a chemical called DCPA or Dactyl. It's an herbicide, which means that it's a weed killer. It shows up in fruits and vegetables, and basically, early on in EPA's assessment, they noticed that in some of those adult animal studies that the industry submitted, it was having effects on the thyroid. And so what that led EPA to do was say, okay, well, we actually need more data here. We need to know if this might change thyroid function during development, because thyroid hormones are really important during development. If they're not at sufficient levels, you can have really serious impacts on brain function and just general development of a normal.
Now, meanwhile, while we're asking the industry for more data, you're eating it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. So
you're
eating it.
Eat up, because we're still trying to figure out.
People are being exposed occupationally. And what happened in this case was the company actually took 10 years to give EPA the data.
What's the hurry?
It doesn't take 10 years to do this study. There's really no reason for that. And what finally showed in the data when they submitted this, again, 10 years later, was that, there actually were really big concerns at lower doses for the impact of the thyroid if you were exposed during pregnancy. And it caused EPA to actually put out this big press release that was saying, if you're somebody who's pregnant and working with DCPA or fruits and vegetables that have been treated with it, you could be exposed to these really harmful levels. And so it's just...
That's a piss off moment.
It's a piss off moment. It's deception on the company's part. It's EPA could have done things to take other precautions. It's just one of those things it really pissed me off.
Yeah, no, I get it. Tell us how you went from being concerned about glyphosate, the Roundup chemical, the Bayer Monsanto weed killer that was showing up in oat products. We had done some testing on it. We published information about it. But then you come across, now, since that's fallen out of favor, apparently, what else is being used? And chlormaquat, again with the quats.
Yeah.
Right?
EWG is investigating glyphosate in oats and other grains. And that's because we knew there were high levels there, actually from some FDA studies originally. We said, okay, let's look into that a little bit more after FDA showed that. And eventually, over our testing, we did testing for 3 or 4 years and saw that those levels seemed to be decreasing a little bit. And it was actually on the suggestion of Carrie Gillum, who has also been on the show, knows a lot about herbicides, specifically glyphosate, that said, well, you know what, maybe there's something else. And so we took a look at what chemicals had recently been approved to have allowable limits, or what are called tolerances, on oats and grains. And there's this chemical called chlormaquat, which, hadn't been there a year or two earlier when we were sort of looking at the same thing. I had never heard about this.
No.
My colleagues in the office next to me had never
Yeah.
heard about this chemical. And so we do what we do, which is we go to the peer-reviewed literature and start investigating what has been published, what can we learn. And there was a lot of reports from the early 2000s, really, that's focused on chlormequat and mammalian fertility. Basically, what they had seen was that chlormequat was used on wheat and grain that was then used for animal feed for pigs. And they saw actually fertility drop in some of the pigs that were fed this chlormequat treated grain. So this was kind of a real world, scenario that was happening. Meanwhile, chlormequat is also found, then in grains and oats that people were consuming. And that seemed to be a study that was just, again, kind of not considered by regulatory agencies. And one of the things that I found so interesting about this, too, was that, remember how I was mentioning a lot of pesticides don't have that up-to-date reproductive toxicity study where you might actually see these effects? Chlormequat is one of them. So for the agency to say, that we know chlormequat is safe, but actually we don't have this updated study, and then there's more data in the literature that's showing effects on fertility and reproduction, that just doesn't really make sense. And so, this was something we wanted people to be aware of. And it was a new chemical in the US.
Yeah.
So this was something where it actually had been used in Europe for a while and was only recently approved in the US. But it shows up as pretty high levels in oats. And then we actually tested a bunch of urine samples and found that over 80% of people were exposed. And this is a totally new chemical and not something that government's monitoring for, not something that agencies that look at urine and chemicals in urine regularly. So it was something that was kind of new.
And already in all of us, or not all of us, but the sample that you took of people, we didn't test the whole population, but of the people we tested,
it
most
needs
of them
more
had it.
study, needs more investigation, but some of that early literature and the presence of it in people, raises a few concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what do you tell your friends and family, and what do you think yourself that's hopeful? What can people do? What are the options that are out there? And I think you're going to say exposure avoidance, but how do you think about giving people hope?
That is true. Exposure reduction, or really thinking about it from a prevention standpoint, is definitely an area where we've been focused. It is an area where academic science is looking, and there's data to show that there are ways to actually change your exposure. So there's a lot of evidence that look at dietary intervention studies. So if you're consuming a conventional diet and you're measuring pesticide levels, and then you actually switch to an organic diet and you measure pesticide levels, it's an effective way to see a reduction in pesticide exposure. And so that might not be something that people can do all the time. I know I can't do that all the time. It's certainly not aiming for perfection by any means, but if we think about some of these sensitive windows of development, we talked about children's health and how there's increased sensitivity and susceptibility. Considering those times as a way to reduce exposure might be beneficial. And, you mentioned our shopper's guide. That's also a way to increase fruit and vegetable consumption of conventional varieties that are low in pesticide residues anyway. That's the Clean 15. But also just to emphasize, fruits and vegetables are so important in our diet. So it's not something that should scare people away from eating them, but it's just worth knowing about sort of the way our food is produced and sort of what goes into that system. And then still pushing for that regulatory change. It's something we're always going to do. There are people working on how to reduce overall pesticide use. It's just also kind of an uphill battle when you have companies that are really trying to push use and register use. So the EPA also has made some good decisions. I do think probably when I was eating baby food, it had more pesticides in it than it does now. So there has been progress, but
we updated our study of baby food.
There's still more work. Yeah. It can be done.
It can be done. Thanks so much for joining. Thank you for your great work for EWG. It's really great to be on a team with you and learn from you.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Temkin. You can find more of her work on ewg.org or by visiting the EWG YouTube page, where Dr. Temkin is your guide to pesticides and chemical exposure. But before you head over there, you're going to want to listen to my conversation with Dr. Phil Landrigan. Let's dive in. Dr. Landrigan, you were there in the founding days of EWG, which were founded in high-profile controversy. Let me just... to the screen here. Pesticides in the Diets of Infants and Children was the National Academy report that was published in the summer of 1993 that changed the debate on not just pesticides policy, but toxics policy because of your work and others on the staff of the National Academy and other members of the committee, including our good friend Dick Jackson and many others, a young analyst who started out running that project for the National Academy, Richard Wiles, the co-founder of EWG, and Dr. Charles Benbrook. There's a long history there, but this report had a huge impact on public health, and it also had a huge influence on EWG. And I just wanted to start there because this was the report that basically said, you know, we ought to be looking not just at the impacts of pesticides on adults, which we did at the time. We should be thinking about the impacts they have on kids, on children, infants and children, just as the title says. And this was a revolutionary insight. Can you say a little bit about that? Because so much of what follows in your career, I think this was not certainly the beginning. You had an illustrious career by this point in 1993, but it's always felt to me that this really helped shape your career from publication forward in terms of themes, efforts you've made in the advocacy world, the fact that you've stepped out of the comforts of a great set of resume items and done battle in the public square, which I've always admired. And I know I've said that to you before. You don't just build a resume or a reputation, you spend it, Phil, and you spend it well in the public interest. So, but how did this report fit into your career, and what did it do to shape human health policy, public health policy?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ken. You're absolutely right that the key insight that emerged from this report is that infants and children are fundamentally different from adults, and that they therefore require special protections against pesticides and other chemicals in law and in regulation. It's interesting to think about that because I venture to say that parents have known since the beginning of time that children are more vulnerable than adults.
For sure.
Pediatricians have known it since the discipline of pediatrics first came into being, which was about a century ago. The insight that children have particular susceptibilities, particular vulnerabilities, was not recognized in Washington. It was not recognized in policy circles, either nationally or at the state level, until this report came out. So that was the big insight. And just to elaborate a bit further, we explored why are children more vulnerable than adults. There are several factors. The first has to do with biology. An infant in the womb, a child in the first years after birth, is going through incredibly rapid, tightly choreographed, very carefully scripted developmental processes. And those processes are so complex that they're easily disrupted, which is why pesticides and lead and other toxic chemicals can cause lasting damage. On top of that vulnerability, if that weren't enough, children are more heavily exposed. Pound for pound of body weight, they're more heavily exposed because they breathe more air, they drink more water, they eat more food. So they take into their little bodies more on a pound per pound basis. They take in more of any toxic pesticide that's in the air, the food, and the water. A third reason is that, as my friend and colleague Dick Jackson used to say, children have a long shelf life. The average child born in the United States today is going to live to be more than 80 years old. And we now understand that toxic exposures in the earliest stages of life can cause disease years, even decades later. What happens is that those exposures cause damage to cells. The damage is not immediately apparent, but with the passage of time, things happen, the damage magnifies, and 20, 30, 50 years later, the child who was exposed to a toxic chemical can develop a cancer, a heart disease, a neurological disease. That was the big insight from our National Academy Committee, that kids are not little adults. They're fundamentally different, and that has to be recognized. Kids have to be protected in law.
And, you know, when the report came out, EWG, we published our first report that same weekend, and it really created an uproar. I think it was enormously threatening, not just to the pesticide industry, but the implication of the insight about the importance of taking care of kids and basing our policy around protecting them had implications across the economy. Certainly across the chemical industry, it had implications for air pollution, water pollution, other realms of environmental law and regulation. I'll just mention this story by Marion Burroughs. Your report was issued on a Friday from the National Academy. This was the front page of the Sunday New York Times, and this was a front page story in practically every paper in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a huge impact on the debate over how to protect kids. And this was during the Clinton administration, fairly powerful impact on the Clinton administration that declared they were going to take on an aggressive posture when it came to pesticides. And then we passed a law in 96 that was based on the principles established by the National Academy report 3 years earlier. Not to fast forward too much, but what has happened since? That's a lot of ground to cover. The science has matured. Policy has evolved. We've had some political regimes that have been more friendly and less friendly to environmental protection. But what's your memory of that Sunday morning or that aftermath of that report when suddenly your work was at the forefront of national attention?
It was very exciting. It was really mind-boggling, in fact. And the National Academy arranged for me to do a whole series of press interviews, one after another, over the span of 48 hours. And there was also a big event in the auditorium at the National Academy of Sciences where we presented the keynote findings. And one senior scientist jumped up and said, how can you say that children are more vulnerable? What's the evidence? And we basically held up the book and said, read it. We've got 600 pages. But that was what happened in July of 1993. Timing is everything. And what's very interesting is that November, the Congress flipped.
Yep.
Newt Gingrich
Historically flipped
down as the Speaker of the House with a very strongly anti-regulatory agenda. So for 30 months approximately, the report, brilliant as we thought it was, sat on the shelves and gathered dust and made no visible impact on Washington policy outside of the Clinton White House. But then in the spring and summer of 1996, things changed. The Gingrich House suddenly realized that many Americans saw them as anti-public health and anti-children.
Yeah.
And so in the span of just a few weeks in the summer of 1996, the Congress passed the Water Act, protecting the waters that people drink in this country. And they passed the Food Quality Protection Act, the pesticide law. At that time, it was the only federal environmental law that contained explicit provisions to protect children's health. It basically gave EPA very careful instructions what EPA had to do to protect kids against pesticides. And the second thing about the Food Quality Protection Act, which is almost unthinkable in today's Congress, is that it was passed by unanimous vote of both houses of Congress and then signed into law by President Clinton a few days later. It was
unheard of.
Unheard of. There was, in fact, a whole cascade of consequences. And as you've intimated, Ken, they went way beyond pesticides. The key tool, the regulatory tool that EPA uses is something called tolerances. A tolerance is the amount of pesticide that EPA allows to be on a food, like a peach, like a strawberry, when that piece of fruit or that vegetable is sold in the market. Most of the food we buy, unless it's organic, USDA certified organic, has one or more pesticides on it, and EPA regulates the amount of pesticides permitted on foods using these things called tolerances. So after the passage of FQPA, EPA was required by law to reduce all of their tolerances tenfold. Next thing that happened was that the EPA, under Administrator Carol Browner, decided to set up an Office of Children's Health Protection. The purpose of that office, which continues to the present time, is that it's supposed to be the conscience within EPA that reaches all across the agency into the Office on Air, the Office on Water, the Pesticide Office, of course, out to the regional offices where so much of the actual work of EPA gets done, to be aware of children's particular vulnerabilities. Another group that picked up on this was the National Institutes of Health. and specifically the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, NIEHS. NIEHS set up the first ever network of children's environmental health research and disease prevention centers in universities across the country, at Harvard, at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, where I was located, and Columbia University, and more. And the director of CDC, Dr. Barry Johnson, established a nationwide network of 10 clinically oriented centers that go by the terrible acronym of PESUs, Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Units. There's one PESU located in each of the 10 federal regions across the country, and a number of them have now spun off satellite centers to extend their geographic reach. And the PESU model was so successful that it's been copied in Mexico and Argentina and Spain and Chile and Uruguay. Each of those units is staffed by pediatricians, nurses, social workers, environmental specialists, and provides direct hands-on clinical care to children who've been exposed to toxic chemicals. Just a brilliant concept. And then the final big thing that rolled out was the National Children's Study. The National Children's Study was enshrined in law by the Congress in the year 2000 through the Children's Health Act of 2000. And the idea was to set up a huge study of 100,000 children that would follow children from pregnancy to age 18 or age 21. And the idea was to use this longitudinal multi-year study to look at the short and the long-term consequences of early life exposures to pesticides and toxic chemicals. A brilliant concept. Unfortunately, it threatened the chemical industry. They were very, very afraid, I think, that the National Children's Study would discover that certain chemicals widely used were causing harm to children that was not yet recognized. So it ran afoul of the chemical industry, and it also ran into headwinds within the National Institutes of Health, who were much more interested in understanding the genetic causes of disease instead of the environmental, ignoring the absolute reality that genes and environment interact every day of a person's life. After about 6 or 7 years, the National Institutes of Health managed to walk away from the National Children's Study, and they defunded it. Other countries, the UK, Scandinavian countries, have also mounted big studies. So the work continues, but some of what we started in the States is now being completed overseas.
Yeah, and I can say that as an advocacy organization, we're involved in state policy, all kinds of federal policy. It is very rare that we will enter a debate now about, for example, setting a limit or trying to regulate these PFAS chemicals, or any new pesticide that might come along, where someone doesn't. And often it's us, but we're in a crowd now. We're not alone. People say, well, shouldn't we add a special consideration for infants and children?
Yeah, that's gone from a fringe idea that was seen as subversive and crazy in the early 1970s to mainstream. And I will give you a pat on the back, Ken, because EWG has done a great deal to mainstream that concept.
Well, we've certainly benefited from your leadership, but now we've built on the precept that infants and children are not small adults. They're completely different critters, developing very rapidly, more exposed per unit of body weight than adults and so forth. Can you mention some of the other ways in which science has identified or refined those concepts, and what some of the impacts of those insights may have been since then?
Yeah, we know so much more about children's vulnerability than we knew back then. Most of the gains have been based on studies of the health impacts of particular chemicals. One chemical that has received a great deal of attention is the organophosphate pesticide, chlorpyrifos. So in its day, chlorpyrifos was the most widely used pesticide in America. It's an insecticide. It's a member of the organophosphate family, which is the same family as sarin, the war gas that was used in the Tokyo subway attacks. It was deliberately engineered by German scientists in World War II to attack the nervous system, which is what it does. That's how it kills insects, and that's how it causes toxic damage in humans, and especially in babies. We've known for a long time, probably since the 1940s or 50s, that high dose exposure of adults to organophosphate chemicals can cause obvious poisoning. People start twitching uncontrollably. They vomit. They have diarrhea. They stream tears from their eyes. They're terribly sick. There is an antidote called atropine, and if you get it into a person quickly, the person recovers. But if you don't treat them properly, they can die. Acute organophosphate poisoning is a nasty way to go. People started asking the question after passage of FQPA, okay, what about lower levels of exposure, especially what about exposures in early life? What impacts do those have? And I think the first people to address that question were a couple of toxicologists at Duke University, Ted Slotkin and his team, and they exposed newborn baby rats to very low doses of chlorpyrifos, levels of chlorpyrifos that are within EPA tolerance levels. What they found was that even very low doses of exposure to chlorpyrifos caused behavioral damages in the rats. It reduced the rats' intelligence. And then when they sacrificed the animals and removed the brains and looked at the brains under the microscope, they found that the animals that had been exposed to very low doses of chlorpyrifos had fewer cells in their brains, fewer neurons than their littermates. This is not good. You don't want to lose neurons if you're going to be a high-functioning adult. So those animal studies prompted human studies, and 3 of the children's centers, the one at Columbia, the one at UCSF in San Francisco, and the one at Mount Sinai, my previous institution, enrolled populations of pregnant women, measured the levels of chlorpyrifos in the women's bodies, and then tracked their children as the children grew up. And they used slightly different tests, different endpoints as they evaluated the children, but all 3 reached agreement on the key finding, which was that prenatal exposure to relatively low doses of chlorpyrifos, the doses that women were encountering in their daily lives, were sufficient to reduce the IQ of their children, to shorten their children's attention span, to impair the children's ability to learn as they grew up. So we had 3 well-designed studies undertaken by different investigators in different populations, and they all showed basically the same thing. This was a powerful demonstration of the fundamental difference between infants and adults in terms of their susceptibility to pesticides. And there have been many other studies done since that time on other chemicals. There have been studies showing that early life exposure to DDT results in an increased risk for breast cancer in a woman's 40s and 50s. There have been studies of brominated flame retardants, very widely used. Prenatal exposure reduces children's IQ. And most recently, people are doing studies of PFAS and documenting the impacts of PFAS on children's growth and development.
What jumps out is that the longer they've been studied and more intensively they've been studied, the lower the safe limit becomes.
Yeah. This experience, which has been repeated time and time again and is even being repeated today as we speak, speaks to the fact that chemical regulation in this country is a mess. We do a pretty good job of regulating pharmaceuticals. It has to go through approval with the Food and Drug Administration, has to be very carefully vetted, clinical trials and so on, before it can be put on the market. And then even after it's on the market, FDA does what they call post-market surveillance. They continue to track people who have taken the drug to make sure that no unexpected side effects pop up. But by contrast, pretty much all the other chemicals on the market enter the market with virtually no assessment whatsoever of their safety, of their toxicity. I don't think most people realize this. I think people go into the supermarket, people go into the pharmacy, they see brightly packaged products on the shelves.
Surely the government wouldn't allow this if it was unsafe. Yeah.
Exactly. But the reality is 90% of the chemicals that are on the market, in products, on the shelves, in the supermarket today, have never, ever been tested for safety. They've never been tested for toxicity. And that's why we continue to have these nasty surprises year in and year out that a certain chemical that's already been out in the marketplace for 5, 10, 20 years is suddenly found to be toxic. And then we get into this whole he said, she said, where the chemical industry says, no, it's really not that toxic. We've been making it. We know it's safe. And then the scientists have to stand up to the chemical industry and say, listen, you're wrong.
Yeah.
This chemical harms children, and that information has to be acted upon, and the chemical has to be either strictly controlled or banned altogether.
And oftentimes we've come to find out the companies knew from their own studies, oftentimes decades earlier, that in fact there were health effects, but for various reasons, including just a decision by the company executives not to report this information when they were required to do so by law, and they didn't report it. PFAS is a great example there. All along, they were withholding information from government regulators that would have changed the complexion of the regulatory decision making.
You're absolutely right. And that's a playbook that actually started back in the 1950s with the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry knew very early on smoking tobacco could cause lung cancer and other cancers and heart disease.
Attacked the scientists who said otherwise. Our dear friend,
Herb
may he
Needleman.
rest in peace, Herb Needleman on lead,
Yeah.
of course.
First, they attack the science itself. Then they attack the scientists who bring it, shoot the messenger, and they say, well, maybe it's harmful, but only at very high doses, and delay while they continue to market the harmful product.
Yeah, and make money. Well, so we know that there's this imbalance between what science knows and when it knows it and when the regulatory system responds. We know that something may be legal, but it isn't safe.
Right.
And this is where I want to introduce the book you wrote with Mary, your wife, Mary. Where should someone start? I get this question all the time. I'm very eager to know how you answer it. Okay, I know the regulatory system is not functioning the way it should. I know the science is telling us we should be protected, but the government's not doing it. Companies aren't doing it. Where do I start? It feels so hopeless sometimes, I think, for parents.
Yeah.
What are the first 3 steps I should take? What 3 areas of life should I look at?
Yeah, that was exactly the framing when Mary and I decided to do this book. She is a public health educator. She was a deputy commissioner for the Westchester County, New York Department of Public Health for 25 years. So she was she was and is very skilled at communicating health messages to the public.
Which is to say you married up.
Indeed. We realized that we had to walk a fine line here, that we had to give people information. These are complex topics, and therefore you have to educate people. You have to give them some facts so that they understand what lead or what pesticides or what air pollution can do to their children. But you also have to empower them with knowledge. You have to give them hope. Frankly, I think it's unethical to simply tell people you've got a big problem and not at least point them in the direction of a solution. Maybe you don't know all the answers, maybe you don't have the full solution, but at least you give them some guideposts. So the first thing is to get educated. Look at our book, look at EWG reports, look at other documentation that's out there. When you're reading documents, look at the source. If it comes from Monsanto, maybe it'll have a bias in favor of chemicals. Be careful of who published the book. And then once you've got some information, people can operate on 3 levels to make a difference for the good. Firstly, in their own home. Parents are the CEO in their own home. So parents can decide what products they're going to put on the table to feed their families, what cleaning products they're going to use. And in the book, we give a whole series of specific suggestions for things that parents can do within their own home. Start with lead. Lead is, even today, even though we haven't used lead paint in this country since 1977, there are hundreds of thousands of homes and apartments that have lead paint. Before you move into a new dwelling, have the place checked for lead paint on the walls. And by the way, parents should not try to remove the lead themselves. It's very hazardous and it can make things worse. We've actually seen situations where pregnant parents tried to de-lead their home, expose themselves, and cause terrible damage to the baby in the womb. Let the specialist do it, and then don't come back until the job is done. Don't come back in the evening. Stay away until the job is completely done. The second one where we offered practical advice was pesticides. Pesticides are so widespread in American society, but one way that a family can reduce their exposure very greatly is by buying certified USDA organic food. People whose diet is mainly based on organic food have 90% less pesticide in their body than people who eat conventional pesticide-treated food. And then the other thing that parents can do to reduce their children's exposure to pesticides is simply don't do cosmetic pesticides on the front lawn or the garden, learn to live with a few dandelions. The French actually eat them as a salad.
What do the French know about food? Right,
French
exactly.
call it pissenlit, and they make a salad out of it. And then a third thing is check the air quality index each day. And if it's a bad air day, that might be a day to restrict your child's outdoor vigorous activity, because when a kid is running around outdoors, they inhale much more air per hour and run the risk of more lung damage. That might be a day to do puzzles or reading or some other indoor activity. So anyway, the first intervention is at the home.
Yeah.
The second level we talked about in the book is the local community. We all live in communities. Parents send their kids to school. There are associations in communities like parent-teacher associations, town governments, block associations, depending on where you are. Those sorts of community-level organizations have a lot of power. For example, they can band together, stop the excessive use of pesticides on school grounds and school playgrounds. They can band together and persuade elected officials not to spend millions of dollars on synthetic turf fields, which are basically made out of toxic chemicals. And then the third level of control is the broader society. We're all citizens, or at least residents within the United States, and we can join together through political parties, through organizations like EWG or the Natural Resources Defense Council or the Environmental Defense Fund or the Sierra Club, to move governments to do the right thing to protect children. Make your voice heard. Politics is like gardening. You have to stay at it. You have to deal with the weeds. But if you're persistent, you'll make a difference.
For sure. You know, we always tell people that the first agency you should look to protect the environment and human health is your own agency.
Yes. One of the things I've tried all through my life is to combine the presentation of information with the generation of hope. Yes, people need to know what they're dealing with, but it's very important that they not be overwhelmed, they not be paralyzed by that knowledge. It's so important that those of us who have given our lives to medicine or nursing or science should not just present the facts, but also give folks a way forward.
Ironically enough, it's never been a better time to be an environmentalist because you have so many options at hand to make a difference. We saw some tremendous setbacks in the first Trump administration to science and environmental protection. What's your sense now about what to tell people that this is on the horizon potentially you need to think about too?
So let me begin by quickly recounting what happened between 2017 and 2020 when Donald Trump was president. I was part of a group who tracked the impact of Trump's deregulatory policies on environmental health. And we saw several bad things. We saw that levels of air pollution in this country went up for the first time in a half century. And with those increasing levels of air pollution, there were more stillbirths, more preterm births in children, and more deaths from heart disease, lung disease, and stroke in adults. We saw that workplace regulations were rolled back, and so there were more deaths from occupational injuries and from occupational diseases. And we estimate that approximately 20,000 unnecessary premature deaths occurred during the first Trump administration. Those were preventable deaths that occurred directly as the consequence of deregulation. I'm very much concerned that if Mr. Trump is reelected, he and his team are going to be much more effective than they were the first time around at dismantling regulation. First time around, they got a slow start. Took them a couple of years to really begin to get their hands on the levers of government. This time, they have a very well-honed playbook, which is called Project 2025, which is a line-by-line, agency-by-agency blueprint of how a second Trump administration would plan to dismantle the federal regulatory structure. It would allow more air pollution, more water pollution. It would strip away regulations on chemicals and pesticides. The result of all this is going to be human suffering. People are going to get sick. People are going to be disabled. People are going to die prematurely. that burden of disease is going to fall particularly heavily on poor, minority, and marginalized people. But it's not going to stop there. The excess disease is going to occur in every state of the union. In the first Trump administration, we looked at deregulation on a state-by-state basis, and we found that the worst impacts occurred in the very states that had voted most strongly for Mr. Trump. Mostly states in Appalachia and across the South showed a real spike in deaths, whereas the blue states, which had stronger state regulatory programs in place, were able to buffer the federal deregulation, at least to some extent. I suspect that in a second Trump administration, that same pattern is going to play out. And the very people that he claims to represent are going to be the people whom he harms. To put it more positively, Republicans and Democrats, we all have to join together. We're all in one country and realize that children are our future. Children are not Democrats. Children are not Republicans. Children are babies. They're humans. And I believe that we have a moral responsibility, an ethical and a moral responsibility to protect children's health, to enable children to grow and to realize their full potential.
Absolutely. And the science is telling us that we need to do a better job of that.
Putting it bluntly, allowing infants and children, including infants in the womb, to be exposed to higher levels of pollution and higher levels of toxic chemicals than they are today is a fundamentally immoral action. And I think people that are weighing the pros and cons of one candidate versus the other have to bear that point in mind.
Vote for the kids.
Vote for the kids, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Temkin and Dr. Landrigan, for coming on the show. And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our show notes for additional links for a deeper dive into today's discussion. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, head on over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. Now, if you like this episode, send it to a friend who you think would like it too. Environmentalism is all about meeting people where they're at. And if you're listening to this, you probably know someone who might be interested in today's episode. They just don't know it yet. My ask is that you send it to that person or as many people as you see fit. Today's episode was produced by the incredible Beth Rowe and Mary Kelly. Dear friends, our show's theme music is by my other friend, Moby. Thanks again for listening.